Thank you, Brad. It certainly is good to be here today, and appreciate Kyle and his prayer, and Neville and his article mentioning about the transition that we're going through in the next few weeks, and we definitely appreciate your prayers. It's always difficult to go through a move when you think about selling a house and buying a house and moving and school changes and all those kinds of things. So keep us in your prayers. We really would appreciate it. We've lived a lot of places. I guess I never thought that I would be a Razorback of all things, and that I'm going to have to learn to say suey on a regular basis. So again, please keep us in your prayers. At least it's still in the SEC. That's only, I think, saving grace about it all. You know, when I was in graduate in Lubbock, Texas, Lubbock is a town, I don't know how big the county is, but Lubbock is a town of around 200,000 people. And it was kind of interesting because at that time, Lubbock was a dry county. I don't think it still is, but it was at the time. And today in Texas, there are 11 counties that are totally dry, and some are what they call moist, and some are wet. And I think even here in Kentucky, there may still be some dry counties. I know that there are definitely some wet and moist counties. But the story is told of a small town that had no liquor stores. But eventually, a nightclub was built right on Main Street. And members of one church in the area were so disturbed by this had appeared that they conducted a series of all-night meetings, prayer meetings, and asked God to burn the place to the ground. And so they had these prayer sessions, and they asked God to burn the place to the ground. Well, lightning struck the tavern a short time later, and it was completely destroyed by fire. The owner of the tavern, the owner of the nightclub, knowing how the believers had prayed for this to occur, he sued the church for damages. His attorney claimed that their prayers had caused the loss. The congregation, on the other hand, hired an attorney and fought the charges. After much deliberation, the judge declared this: "It's the opinion of this court that wherever the guilt may lie, the tavern keeper is the only one who really believes in prayer, while the church members do not." You know, it's entirely possible to go through the external motions of faith while at the same time having no faith at all. That is, praying, and when their prayer was supposedly answered, they reneged on the faith that they had. Kind of reminds me of the narrative in Acts chapter 12 when Peter was in prison. Do you remember that? And the church was earnestly praying that prison. And eventually, of course, miraculously, he was released from prison. But when he appeared at the house of the believers that were praying for his release, they doubted that in fact it was him. And so again, they were going through the motions of prayer, but they weren't actually convinced when their prayer was answered. I want us this morning to consider the model of Moses. When we think of someone and we think of faith and we think of their life and how faith was an impetus for them to be successful as a child of God. I think when we think of Moses, we often think of mountains. And in particular, we think of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is around 7,600 feet high. Today, it is known to be Jebel Musa, or the Mount of Moses. Moses and this mountain have a very real connection. The text that Brad read for us in Exodus chapter 19, verse 17 Of course, we know that Moses went up to that mountain to eventually receive the law from God. And of course, a lot of revelry took place at the base of the mountain while he was at the top of the mountain. And Steve talked about that this morning in our Bible class. He was a great lawgiver. His faith was exemplified on the mountain. And he was actually given access to God while he was on the mountain. It's kind of interesting if you go back to Exodus chapter 3, where God appeared to Moses in the manifestation of a burning bush. That was on Mount Horeb, which is actually Mount Sinai. And notice, if you will, in Exodus chapter 3, look at verse 12. Exodus 3 and verse 12, and that incident with the burning bush. Notice what he says. And he said, is God, certainly I will be with you, that is Moses, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. So the whole burning bush scene took place at Mount Sinai, and eventually God would draw Moses and the Israelites back to Mount Sinai. A lot of rich history at this mountain. And so this mountaintop scene will serve as our launching pad this morning as we examine truly the faith of Moses. Now, Moses lived to be 120 years of age, and his life had three distinct divisions, and each one of those divisions lasted 40 years. First of all, when you think about his home, he lived in a palace for 40 years. He lived in a desert of desolation for 40 years. And then he went searching for the land of promise for 40 years. When you think about his identity, for 40 years he was a prince of Egypt. For 40 years he was a shepherd in the desert. And for 40 years he was a for God. And then finally, when it comes to God, for 40 years he was involved in the pagan idolatry of the Egyptians. For another 40 years, he kind of served himself as God. And then ultimately, in the latter 40 years of his life, he would serve the true God. I believe, and as you look through his life, and you look at these 40 different years, these 3 times of 40 years, you can definitely see growth and progression in his faith. And I do believe the catalyst for his spiritual growth and development was his faith. And so the first thing that I want to impress upon you this morning is this. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, chose a new identity. Moses deliberately turned his back on a privileged life as a member of the aristocracy of ancient Egypt, which at that time it's hard for us to imagine, but that truly was the superpower of the day. As a member of the royal family, he could have finished his days in pampered luxury. Different, far different from the slave roots from which he came. But instead, he gave all of that up. He chose God. And his choice was not the romantic impulse of a teenager who wants to change the world. At age 40, Moses chose to identify himself with the people of God. Look, if you will, in Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. Exodus 2, 11 through 15. And notice the text. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw that there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him. He buried him in the sand. And he went out on the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill us as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now, all of his intentions were probably not pure, and his actions certainly can't be justified. But he definitely made a decision to choose to be a follower of God, to truly be a Hebrew instead of being an Egyptian. You know, that's what's kind of interesting about Moses and many of the characters that we read about in the Old Testament. They were flawed people, just like us. They weren't perfect people, just like us. But Moses was a man who had this overarching theme of trying to follow God and wanting to be faithful to God. In fact, over in the New Testament, notice what the Hebrew writer would say in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 25 and 26 about Moses. "Choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward." Definitely, Moses had this foresight even as a relatively younger man. The same is true with us today. There are choices to be made, choices which are costly. You can't have the best of what the world offers, whether it's power, whether it's self-service, whether it's sensual pleasure, and still have a deep and intimate relationship with Christ. We live in a world today where people say you can have it all. You can have this strong faith, this right kind of relationship with God, and you can have everything else. You can have all the pleasures of the world. But we bought into a lie if we believe that. You can't have both. You have to make a decision. Notice what Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, verses 29 through 34. Luke chapter 12, verses 29 through 34. He says, "And do not what you shall eat and what you shall drink, and do not keep worrying. For these things the nations of the world eagerly seek, but your Father knows that you need these things." Well, what should we do, Jesus? Notice what he says in verse 31. "But seek for his kingdom, and these things shall be added to you." In other words, put Christ first, put the church first, and God will take care of these things. "Do not be afraid," verse 32, "little flock, for your Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to charity, make yourself purses which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near, nor moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." So the message that Jesus gives to us, you've got to make a decision. You know, Moses had to make a decision. I can live in the lap of luxury here in Egypt. I can be called a prince. I can be a part of Pharaoh's extended, or I can choose to suffer with my fellow brethren, with the Egyptians, with the Hebrews. And so we too have to make those same decisions. To turn from the pursuit of the pleasures of sin and the treasures of Egypt, and to walk God's road in life. We can set our sights on living close to God and gaining heaven. The second thing I want to impress upon you this morning is this. We learned that it was faith that caused Moses to discover a new God. Surely Moses was trained in the religious practices of Egypt. Pharaoh was deified, and Moses was taught to worship his step-grandfather as the son of the gods who brought favor to Egypt. No doubt that was the mantra of the home that he was in. But somewhere, he also gained a knowledge of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Was it through his mother? Was it curiosity that he had? Was it God's Spirit within him that impelled him? Initially, he rejected the gods of Egypt, and he went on serving himself. Taking matters into his own hands, he actually killed a man. He was a murderer. His service of self brought him a desert of isolation for some 40 years, where God took an impulsive man and made him a patient man. And he would need that patience for those latter 40 years of his life as he dealt with the Israelites and all of their groans and moans and all of their ups and downs. But God was still in the midst of it all. He was pursuing Moses. And one day he would meet Moses in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 10, when they met in that manifestation of a burning bush. You can discover the name of your God by examining your life and looking at what you pursue most diligently. Is it your retirement account? Is it wealth? Is it family? Is it a boyfriend? Is it a girlfriend? Is it your career? Is it your hobby? A little bit of self-disclosure here. I've had to be careful. As you know, the stock market's been doing pretty well these days. And on my phone, I have an app where I can check on my retirement account. In fact, I've got 2 different apps for 2 different retirement accounts. And I've gotten into a practice, and I've got to be really careful about this, on going on there almost every day with the retirement account, because it's doing really well. The stock market's doing really well. But if we're not careful, that becomes our God. That becomes our idol. We're constantly checking that and seeing how the money's going and seeing what our retirement looks like. And then all of a sudden, our faith is no longer in God. Our faith is in the stock market. Our faith is in our money. And we need to be careful that we don't do that. In Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 13 through 14, notice what God says through the prophet here. Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 13 and 14. And you will seek me and find me when you search with me with all your heart. Sometimes I wonder if we're really searching with God with A-L-L, all of our heart. Look at verse 14. If you'll search with me with all of your heart, and I will be found by you, declares the Lord. And I will restore your fortunes, and I will gather you from all the nations and from all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from where I sent you into exile. By faith, Moses found God. We all must seek him without reservations. And again, in that great chapter in Hebrews chapter 11, that great Hall of Faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, and without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. The third thing I want to impress upon you this morning is this. Faith caused Moses to set out for a new home. From the time Moses left the privileged until he stood on the heights of Mount Nebo to look into the promised land, 80 years had passed by. 80 years. It must have seemed like an endless journey. He was detoured, as you know, by the decisions of those around him. That 40 extra years that was added to the journey was due to the lack of faith of the Israelites, who did not believe the report of Joshua and Caleb, but instead believed the report of the other spies. As a result, they had to wander another 40 years. He himself grew willful and missed the plan of God once more. As you know the story of Moses, once again, a flawed man. He was supposed to speak to the rock. He hit the rock. As a result of that, he was not allowed to go into the promised land. But he kept looking for the land until he finally found it. What is your ultimate destination? And I'm not talking about that Disney vacation that you're saving for. And I'm not talking about retirement in Boca. And I'm not talking about that trip someplace that you want to go to that you're saving up money for. Do you have heaven in sight as your ultimate destination? Again, if you look at Hebrews chapter 11, notice the text there. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 through 16. And notice what it says there. Hebrews 11, 13 through 16. After it lists all these great people from the Old Testament and the faith that they had, notice what it says about them. And these died in faith without receiving the promises. They were told about, but they didn't see it in their lifetime. They were told about a Christ, but they didn't see it in their lifetime. They were told about a church, but they didn't see it in their lifetime. And these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Sometimes I forget, and you forget, and we forget that we are strangers in this land. We are exiles in this land. Oftentimes we feel comfy and cozy here in America, but the reality is this is not our home. We're waiting for. Verse 14, for those who say such, make it clear they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has a city that is prepared for them. We sometimes sing songs with titles that are designed to invoke within us and instill within us this desire of heaven. When we all get to heaven, we sometimes sing that song. I am bound for the promised land. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. Heaven will truly be worth it all. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop. Those songs set in our mind a certainty. This world is not our home. You know, a lot of us are patriotic, and it's good to be patriotic. I'm not knocking that at all. But a lot of times we are more committed to this country and the place in which we live than we are for our heavenly country, which is the place we really should long to go to. We should feel really out of our skin here. This is not a comfortable place. This is not the place we want to live forever. There's a better place. And if we find ourselves having this degree of, certainty about where we're at right now, that's a little scary. We need to be seeking that better country. We're on our way to our home. And hopefully as we get older, heaven sounds sweeter and sweeter. Aim your life toward heaven. And then finally, faith caused Moses to trust in God. Hebrews 11:28. Remember all those plagues that came upon the Egyptians, which were designed to get Pharaoh to move and have the Israelites released from bondage. And it took all these plagues for him to really get the point that God was serious and He wanted His people moved out of slavery and He wanted His people free. In those plagues, one by one, God showed His superiority over the Egyptian deities, over the Egyptian gods, lowercase g. In fact, it's kind of interesting, the first plague, which was the Nile turning to blood, that happened during the flood stage, which would have been September, October. The final plague didn't take place, that is the death of the firstborn, the 10th plague, until around March or April. So if you're looking at a time frame, this took about 6 or 8 months. A lot of times we think when we read the account in the Old Testament, we think that, one plague didn't work, second plague didn't work, third plague didn't work, and each time, it was like the next day. This was kind of strung out over a period of 6 to 8 months until finally the plague occurred, which jolted Pharaoh and his household that God was really serious and wanted his people released. The firstborn died, except where the blood of the lamb was placed on the sides and the tops of the door frames of the homes of both the Israelites and the Egyptians, if they so chose, and apparently some did. Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 through 28. As you'll recall, that night they ate a lamb, and there were special instructions given regarding that lamb. And as the angel saw the blood on the doorpost and on the frame of the door, the death angel would, or the angel would pass over. And ultimately, the Israelites would celebrate the Passover feast, because when the blood was found, the angel would pass over and no death would come to that home. Moses faithfully followed God's command. Now, I don't know about you, that seems kind of goofy, right? Putting blood on a doorpost, putting door on the lintel, and somehow, because the angel passed by and the angel saw the blood and there was no death to come to the household. Jesus is our Passover lamb. His life was given for us. And for our salvation, we don't put physical on a doorpost, but we do need blood. And we come in contact with blood through baptism. And somebody says, well, that's the silliest thing I ever heard. You got to be baptized to come in contact with the blood of Christ? That's what God says. Moses may have said, pretty silly to put physical blood on a doorpost. You mean that's going to save my family? Ask all the people in Egypt who didn't do that night, right? They didn't do that silly act. And as a result, there was death of the firstborn in their home. Moses, by faith, did it. And we as well, by faith, should adhere to God's commands. As we bring these thoughts to conclusion this morning, the faith of Moses, his faith propelled him to find a new identity. It propelled him to discover the true nature of God, to set out for a new home, and to get the grace of God during a time of judgment. It truly was a mountaintop of faith, from below Sinai to the top of Sinai and back down from Sinai. Moses was a man of faith. When you examine your life this morning, maybe you're someone who you've kind of just been going through the motions. I think we do that sometimes. We get into ruts, don't we? We get into spiritual ruts, and we just kind of go through the motions. And we forget that our faith is to be active and motivating, and it's supposed to be life-changing and really impact how we live and how we think and how we interact with others. Maybe you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters here in Christ and the prayers of the elders so that you can infuse within yourself the faith that you need to take on the challenges of this life. Maybe you aren't a Christian this morning. You need to come in contact with that blood. That blood saved the Israelites that night. And the blood of Jesus can save you by being baptized, by having your sins washed away, by being immersed in water. If we can help you in any way, won't you? Please come forward while together we stand and sing to encourage you.